The Honourable Minister for the Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak to this motion. When the government was elected, we committed to work tirelessly to honour the trust that Canadians have given us. We committed to bring new leadership and a new tone to government, listening to the needs of Canadians and working collaboratively to tackle the real challenges we face as a country. Unfortunately, instead of focusing on these real challenges that Canadians across the country face, challenges like seeking better job opportunities, finding affordable housing, advancing equal rights, or dealing with other pressing issues like climate change, the member for St. Albert Edmonton felt it was important to discuss this frivolous motion, a motion that I can confidently say is without merit. However, I am happy to stand here today to speak about the amazing efforts that our government has made to increase transparency and accountability, as well as our strong commitment to an open and honest government that Canadians deserve. We also committed to tracking our progress and relying on evidence. So what does the evidence say about Canadians' trust in government? An ACOS poll this week showed that Canadians' trust in government has skyrocketed to levels not seen since the mid-1970s. Canadians trust us because they know that we are serious about openness and accountability. For the past 10 years, Canadians have witnessed the most secretive government in Canada's history, one that has shut out scientists and closed the door on evidence-based decision-making. They are also a government that has been riddled with election scandals and unethical misconduct. Under the former Conservative government, Conservative Senator Mike Duffy inappropriately billed taxpayers as he engaged in Conservative Party fundraisers across the country. This happened under the former government's watch. And this unethical behaviour is not just limited to the Conservatives, but the NDP have also misused Canadian taxpayer dollars. From the Conservatives' many instances of overspending on election expenses to the NDP's misappropriation of millions of taxpayer dollars, which they funneled to partisan satellite offices, Canadians have had enough of this behaviour. Canadians want a government that they can trust, which is why voters chose to elect a Liberal majority to bring real change to Canada. And I am very proud to be part of this change and to stand here with a government that is committed to measures for a more open and accountable government. Our government is committed to taking a different approach than the previous Conservative government. And that is why, in November, our Prime Minister issued Open and Accountable Government, which sets core principles regarding the roles and responsibilities of ministers in Canada's system of responsible parliamentary government. At the core of this guide is the understanding that public office holders must maintain integrity in order to be worthy of Canadians' trust. Open and accountable government recognizes this importance, and it states in its guidelines on ethical standards, public officers shall act with honesty and uphold the highest ethical standards so that public confidence and trust in the integrity, the objectivity, the impartiality of the government are conserved and enhanced. And I have no doubt that while the member for St. Albert Edmonton would like to make claims that question the Minister of Justice's conduct, that she is an individual of utmost integrity who Canadians can trust as the legal advisor to the Cabinet and the Chief Law Officer of the Crown. It is a tremendous role, but one that I know that the Minister of Justice is well equipped to take on. In fact, despite what the member for St. Albert Edmonton's motion seems to imply, the Justice Minister acted accordingly with the Conflict of Interest Act and proactively sought the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner's advice on her fundraising activity. All members in the House are familiar with and have likely engaged in fundraising activity for their party. These are normal, routine activities that members undertake to support their party, but to also engage with Canadians. In the fundraising activity that the member for St. Albert Edmonton is referring to in his motion, the minister appeared as a member of Parliament. Further to this, her conduct was cleared by the Commissioner, and the member for St. Albert Edmonton knows this very well. He received a response from the Commissioner addressing his baseless claims that he had raised in relation to this fundraising activity. I'm not sure why the member has continued to pursue this in light of the response from the Commissioner. But I will take this moment to again reiterate that the Minister of Justice took all the appropriate measures to ensure that she was not in contravention with the Conflict of Interest Act and did not transgress Section 16 of the Act, which pertains to fundraising activities. Further to this, pursuant to Elections Canada's regulations, the Liberal Party will be entirely responsible for all costs associated with the event. The Liberal Party fully complies with the Elections Act in all of its fundraising activities. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to being open and accountable and ensuring that our ministers discharge their duties with integrity and meet the fundamental principles of our system of responsible government. In meeting these duties, open and accountable government sets out the Prime Minister's expectations for their personal conduct, which includes compliance with the statutory obligations under the Conflict of Interest Act and the Lobbying Act. At this point, I would like to take this opportunity to discuss Canada's conflict of interest regime. Our country has benefited from a robust regime, and Canada continues to rank among the most ethically governed countries in the world. This is due to the fact that the Conflict of Interest Act establishes strict rules for all full-time public office holders. The Act applies to the Prime Minister, ministers, ministers of state, parliamentary secretaries, and ministers-exempt staff. It also applies to almost all governor and council appointees, including deputy and associate deputy ministers, heads of agencies and CEOs, chairs and members of Crown corporations, boards, commissions, and tribunals. All of these public office holders are subject to a set of general conflict of interest rules set out in Part 1 of the Act. This includes the core rule that public office holders are to avoid conflicts between private interests and their official duties. Some public office holders are also considered to be reporting public office holders under the Act, and this includes ministers, parliamentary secretaries, full-time exempt staff, and full-time governor and council appointees. Reporting public office holders are subject to additional rules and obligations under the Act, including a prohibition on engaging in outside employment or other activities, a requirement to make various confidential and public disclosures of assets, liabilities, and other private interests, and to divest through sale or blind trust certain assets such as publicly traded stocks, a 1 to 2 year cooling-off period in which they are prohibited from accepting employment or appointments with organizations which they had direct or significant official dealings with during their last year in office. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, the conflict of interest regime in Canada is a robust regime that has evolved over time. Let me give you a bit of its historical context. It used to be that the conflict of interest rules that applied to ministers, parliamentary secretaries, other public office holders, and parliamentarians were found in federal statutes like the Criminal Code and the Parliament of Canada Act. However, starting with former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's guidelines for cabinet ministers in 1973, these statutory rules were replaced or supplemented by conflict of interest rules and guidelines. Today, the Conflict of Interest Act outlines the expectations and requirements for public office holders. The Senate and the House of Commons have further adopted the Parliamentary Conflict of Interest Codes to govern the conduct of their members. Changes were made to the Conflict of Interest regime by the Federal Accountability Act, which brought the Conflict of Interest Act into law. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the conflict of interest regime we have in this country has helped to guarantee the integrity of our public office holders and our democratic system of government. I believe Canadians are well served by the framework that we have in place today, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, despite the claims made by the member from St. Albert, Edmonton, the Minister of Justice was not in contravention of the Act. Moving forward, I have every confidence that Canadians will continue to be well served with this framework. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to an open, honest government that is accountable to Canadians and lives up to the highest ethical standards. As detailed in the Open and Accountable Government, it is critical to the principle of responsible government that all organizations within the executive be the responsibility of a minister who is accountable to Parliament. And, Mr. Speaker, I can confidently say that the Minister of Justice is an individual of utmost integrity that Canadians can depend on to be fully accountable to Parliament. Again, as stated in Open and Accountable Government, the Minister is accountable to Parliament for the proper functioning of his or her office and department and all other organizations within his or her portfolio. Ministers fulfill this accountability by demonstrating appropriate diligence and competence in the discharge of their responsibilities. Of course, what constitutes appropriate ministerial oversight will depend on the nature of the organization and the minister's role. Where arm's-length bodies are concerned, the minister's engagement will be at a more systemic level. I am pleased to note that the open and accountable government includes new guidance to assist ministers in respecting the parameters of their responsibility with respect to arm's-length organizations. Ministerial accountability to Parliament does not mean that a minister is presumed to have knowledge of every matter that occurs within his or her department or portfolio, nor that a minister is necessarily required to accept personal responsibility for every matter. Given the size and complexity of government, this would be an impossible standard to meet. However, the Prime Minister has made clear in open and accountable government that his expectations is that ministers will take appropriate corrective action to address any problems that may arise in their portfolios in a manner that is consistent with their role with respect to the organization in question. He has also indicated that he expects ministers to attend to all matters in Parliament that concern any organizations for which they are responsible, including responding to questions. As the Prime Minister has stated, open and transparent government is good government. It strengthens trust in our democracy and ensures the integrity of our public institutions. Canadians have indicated their support for the progress the government has made so far in this area, and they expect us to continue. We must never cease to earn and to keep their trust. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I would like to reiterate that the member for St. Albert Edmonton's motion is baseless in questioning the conduct of the Minister of Justice. Again, as I have said before, she attended the event as a Member of Parliament and followed all fundraising rules outlined in the Elections Act. In her correspondence with the member for St. Albert Edmonton, the Commissioner found that the Minister was not in contravention of Section 16 of the Act, and I am proud to call the Minister a friend and a colleague. And I know that Canadians are being well served by a minister that is committed to upholding the rule of law and protecting the rights of Canadians. I am also proud to be a part of a government that is committed to being open and transparent with all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Caribou, Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable colleague, our Minister of Status of Women, for her speech today. Mr. Speaker, this is about trust. That's all it is. I won't go as far to say that the Minister of Justice misled Canadians. Again, we'll go back to say maybe there was a mistake made. But it also should pass the smell test. And, Mr. Speaker, I have a quote here that I'd like to read. It is totally incomprehensible to me how a minister of our federal crown, the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General at that, participating in a private fundraiser with lawyers can be said to escape either the reality or the appearance of a conflict of interest. Mr. Speaker, who said that? The former Premier of British Columbia, the former Attorney General of British Columbia, and a former Liberal Minister of Health, Ujjal Dosanjh. And if it doesn't pass the smell test with this gentleman, how can the government expect it to pass the smell test for Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of the Status of Women.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Actually, we have an ethics commissioner, and the Minister of Justice followed all of the requirements of a minister in consulting with the ethics commissioner about the appropriateness of this particular fundraiser. And so I have confidence, like the Canadians that have placed their trust in us, in the ethics commissioner's ruling. And I believe that the ethics commissioner has details that perhaps the people that the member has quoted does not. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Edmonton, Strathcona.
And through you, I'd like to put a question to the honourable member. We are hearing a lot in this place, including from the honourable member, about what the law states and the ruling by the ethics commissioner. But what troubles me is this new Liberal government has propensity, instead of amending the law to include what they uphold as stronger principles, for example, environmental assessment, instead of amending the law or the rules to now allow citizens to participate, they simply issued non-binding guidelines. Well, the member's party in November last year issued Open Accountable Government guide stating ministers and parliamentary secretaries must ensure their fundraisers avoid soliciting political contributions. And then the Prime Minister issued to all of his ministers and parliamentary secretaries very clear directives that they must ensure that they not appear to affect the exercise of the official duties or access of individuals. There should be no preferential access to government or appearance of preferential access. There should be no singling out or appearance of singling out individuals. Very clear direction to the ministers and parliamentary secretaries that they should take greater care in solicitation of political contributions. Now, there's a lot of argument being made that the Minister of Justice, the Attorney General, was there in her own right. But surely the presumption that the Minister of Justice is there with people who could potentially be seeking judicial appointments, surely greater care and attention should be taken among all cabinet members by the Minister of Justice.
The Honourable Minister of the Status of Women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not sure exactly what the question is in that statement, but I will say that, in fact, we stand by the open and accountable government. It is a significant improvement in our commitment to transparency and accountability to Canadians. And furthermore, I would say that the Minister of Justice dealt with her responsibility to act in an ethical manner by seeking the advice of the Ethics Commissioner. This is not to be understated. We all have that responsibility as ministers to work with the Ethics Commissioner. In fact, I have several times asked the Ethics Commissioner myself about actions that may or may not be prudent and have received excellent advice. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Toronto Danforth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank the Minister of Status of Women for her statements and giving us a better history of the Office of the Ethics Commissioner. What I would like to ask her is that in my discussions with people in my community and when I'm in my riding, people are talking to me about jobs, about health. They have questions about transit funding, about the budget, many questions that they have raised. And when I have heard from the opposition when presenting this motion, are a lot of questions about the trust and the faith of Canadians, and that is what the issue is. And what I would like to ask the Minister is if she has any comments about what she is hearing in her community about what they are placing their trust and faith in. What are they looking for? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of the Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to the member for her question. In fact, I have not had any conversations about this issue in my riding in terms of the Minister of Justice. And just as the member has pointed out, the conversations that I am having are twofold. One, the incredible need that exists in our communities for good legislation that addresses many of the needs that Canadians are facing in regards to housing, facing in regards to employment, the widening gap between people who have wealth and who do not, people who have difficulty accessing services. These are the kinds of things that I'm facing. In fact, in our constituency work, one of the things that we deal with the most in my riding, Thunder Bay Superior North, which surprised me, is immigration issues. And you wouldn't think that from a riding that's not known for a vast amount of immigration. But in fact, because of changes made that have deleteriously affected our immigration system, we have many people in our riding that are struggling tremendously to address the needs that they face. So I echo my colleagues' concerns around diverting the conversation from these very real challenges that Canadians face to something that has been explained over and over in the House that has the full consent of an Ethics Commissioner. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Richmond-Tabasca. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable colleague for his speech. Ever since I've been here in the House, I've heard words from this government and the second opposition party, words like unfounded motion, frivolous motion, uninteresting subject. There are all kinds of ways to talk about this motion tabled by our party. We're talking here about conflict of interest, privileged access, undue influence, trust by the public, cynicism about politicians. When I went into politics, a journalist asked me, if you were elected, if you were in government, what would be the first thing you would do if you had the power to change something? And I said, some kind of concrete action so that the public can restore its trust in politicians in order to take care of issues like immigration and finances and defense and all the other issues that citizens talk to us about in our riding. But they have to trust us. So my question for the honourable colleague opposite is this. Does she feel that the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, who was involved in fundraising activity in a law firm, is that ethically acceptable? Does she feel that the money should be reimbursed what it was collected during that activity? The Honourable Minister of Status of Women.
Thank you to my colleague for the question. In fact, let us be clear about trust. It is the member opposite and his party that is seeking to undermine the trust of Canadians. And I have to tell the member and you, Mr. Speaker, that when I was campaigning as a candidate for the first time for a federal office, one of the most disheartening things I heard was the distrust that Canadians had in their politicians based on 10 years of unethical behaviour. And thank you, yes. And to me, one of the best privileges of being an MP is actually restoring that trust. As I travel through my riding, after winning this candidacy, after becoming an MP for Thunder Bay Superior North, after receiving the great honour of becoming a cabinet minister, all I have heard from Canadians in my riding and across this country as I travel is thank you. Thank you so much for bringing back accountability, transparency, ethics, and we believe in the work that you're doing. And we know that it won't be without difficulty. And we know that you will not always agree. But we know that you will do your best. And I am incredibly and immensely proud of the response that Canadians are having to our government. Thank you very much.